let's switch to English and let's start with today's lesson. Today we are going to dive into a completely new topic. We covered at the beginning of this course year a lot of C# basics, .NET 5 and so on. Then we switched to Entity Framework and learned how to access databases. And today we are going to start a series of lectures about building web APIs with ASP.NET Core. So we stick to C#, we stick to .NET 5, and we are going to build web APIs with .NET. That will be very interesting, hopefully very interesting, because by knowing about ASP.NET Core, the kind of samples that we are able to build will become much more interesting. Because up to now, we were just always building console apps, and just printing something on the console is not the most exciting thing on earth. So today, we will enter a new universe of possibilities, if you want, and that is ASP.NET Core. So we will also now build a bridge to Angular, your UI technology that you have already learned. So we will try to bring together all the things that you learned so far this year. We will build a web API, we will access databases in the backend, we will use C# for that, and we will use Angular as our frontend. So today's lecture is not a pre-recorded video, because I thought that it would be nice to change things a little and do a live session today. And in this live session, I would ask you to follow along. Because we start in a new topic, I guess you might have questions every now and then. And therefore, it makes sense to make this lesson live. Okay? We will spend approximately 2 hours, 2.5 hours, something like this on this topic. Of course, we will do breaks, don't worry. And after that, you have time to work on the topic of ASP.NET Core Web APIs on your own. I already created an exercise for you. I have sent you the link, the GitHub Classroom link through I think I put it in Discord. Yeah, I think through Discord. So you can take a look at the link there, and as I said, after the lesson together with me, you have time to practice what you have learned. I will be here until the end of this morning's lesson and answer any question, help you overcome any problem, or help you overcome any misunderstandings or problems that you have understanding the topic. It doesn't matter if you have questions regarding Entity Framework, C#, .NET, ASP.NET, just ask. Take the time, take the opportunity to ask questions and yeah, exercise what we have learned. Nevertheless, in the morning, we will go through a nice little sample together. So I ask you to start Visual Studio and start by creating a new project. Let me start my zooming tool so I can draw a little bit. Yeah, question. Yeah. By the way, I'm recording this session, but as always, I do not record your voices, so you will not be seen on the video and your voices will not be heard. So if you ask any questions, don't worry, they will not be on the recording on YouTube. So you can ask questions whenever you want without having to fear that your privacy will be somehow negatively influenced. Okay, Visual Studio 2019, we will create a new project. And in this project, this time, we are going to build an ASP.NET Core web application. This is what I would like to do together with you. Please click on ASP.NET Core web application and hit next. And then choose a folder where you would like to store this solution and project. And what are we going to store? Any ideas? I want to build a small little API with which we can store some things. You know what? We heard a lightning talk about Ready Player One today. So let's build an API with which we can store our favorite collection of video games. So let's call it our Video Game Manager. And we'll store some video games. Oh, that sounds good. It doesn't matter whether you hit this, click this button here or not. It just changes where your solution file is stored. We will just have a single project in the solution, so check it or not, it doesn't matter for our simple example. Hit create, please. The next thing in our wizard here is that we can, on the one hand side, select the version, and guess what? We will stay with the latest version of ASP.NET, which is ASP.NET Core 5. And down here, we can select the kind of application we would like to build. Let me quickly go through that. The first one, ASP.NET Core Empty, will give you a completely empty ASP.NET Core application. If you really know what you are going to do, if you master ASP.NET Core already, then you can start with an empty project and add exactly those artifacts that you would like to have in your project. So this gives you the most control. On the other hand, you need to have really good knowledge about the underlying platform. So this is not something to start with. The second one is the one that we are going to choose, ASP.NET Core Web API. This will give us a web API, an HTTP-based JSON web API. This is what we are going to do. This is perfect if you want to build your user interface with a single page app platform like Angular, then this is exactly the thing that you would like to choose. If you would like to generate the HTML, the dynamic HTML on the server side instead of the client side. So if you do not want to have Angular on the client, but just render HTML directly on the server, then you have the next two options. You can say ASP.NET Core Web App, which uses the technology ASP.NET Razor Pages. This is the newest and most modern way of building server-side web applications in ASP.NET Core. So if you build a new server-side rendering app in ASP.NET Core, this is probably the thing that you want to choose. There is a more elaborate way of building apps. It is also a little bit older. It's the modal view controller pattern. It is okay for large applications. If you work in an enterprise scenario, this might be exactly what you want to have. But for us, the first one, ASP.NET Core App, would be better. However, we are not going to take a look at these things in this course because we are going to focus on web APIs. You learned Angular as your front-end technology, so I will not burden you with another front-end technology. So forget about these two. Out of curiosity, I just told you how they work. The next one might sound interesting, ASP.NET Core with Angular. This is a nice template if you want to combine a web API with an Angular frontend. But, and now that is important, we will not use that one. Why? Because I would like to show you how Angular and web APIs really work together. This ASP.NET Core with Angular template is so much Harry Potter programming. It does so much magic, and I don't want to start with this magic because it will somehow magically work and you don't really understand how it works. And I don't like that. Therefore, we will not use it, we will build that on our own. If you want, if you are curious, try it out with the things that you learn in this course and with your existing Angular knowledge, you should be able to understand what's going on behind the scenes. But as I told you, it's nice, you can try it, but not for this course. And the rest, yeah, we don't cover React in this course. So this is the thing that we are going for in this exercise. Go for ASP.NET Core Web API, and on the right-hand side, please make sure that you have this configure for HTTPS and enable Open API support. These two things should be checked, and I will tell you more about that later on. We will not talk about Docker in this course, at least not yet. So forget about this enable Docker support. We don't need it. If you have that, click on Create. I hope that for those of you who use Rider as their IDE will have similar choices when creating an ASP.NET Core Web API project. After a few seconds, you should have an ASP.NET Core Web API project, and we will take a look at the anatomy of this project in a second. I will just drink something so that everybody can catch up. The first thing that I ask you to do, and I do that always because I don't like the old Internet Information Server, is I would like to switch here, up here, away from Internet Information Server to this one. This is the name of your project, and this will make sure that your app runs as a console app. This gives you way more control over what is going to happen, and in this course and also in reality out there, most companies do no longer run .NET applications inside of Internet Information Server, because out there in the cloud, public cloud, private cloud, Kubernetes, Docker and so on, everything runs on Linux, essentially. Linux is the go-to operating system when it comes to server-side applications. So therefore, Internet Information Server Express was important a few years ago. It is still important for some companies, but in most cases, you don't want to have Internet Information Server. So switch to this one. If you would like to get rid of this IIS stuff in the first place, just right-click on the project. This is optional. You do not have to do that if you don't want to, but I just want to show it to you. Right-click on the project, click on Properties, go to Debug, and here you see the different profiles. You see it? And if you switch to IIS Express, you can just hit Delete, and then it's gone. So if you don't like, just like me, if you don't like the IIS option up here, you can get rid of it by removing it. That's not an absolute must, but yeah, it is somewhat convenient if you don't have unrelevant options in your IE. Good, so remember that. We are not going to use IIS Express in this course. What does that mean? If we switch to the video game manager here, try it, just hit play, hit run, F5 would be the shortcut for that. Visual Studio will build your app, it will build the C# code, and as you can see, a web application in ASP.NET Core is nothing else than, this is what comes up, is nothing else than a console app. So here on the right-hand side, you see a console app. It's really just a console app, just exactly the same that you have built in the last few weeks, but this time you are firing up a web server inside of your console app. So with ASP.NET, you do not need any heavyweight web server like Tomcat or whatever. The web server is built in to your C# app. You just build a console app, the web server will be inside of it, and if you want to ship it, if you want to give it to a friend or a customer or run it in the cloud, all you need to deploy is your console app. And if somebody starts the console app, the web server will start automatically. You do not need to install any kind of web server if you don't want to. Of course, in practice, there are many situations where you combine .NET with web servers like Nginx or something like this. Nginx is a very widely used web server on Linux, used as a so-called reverse proxy for some things. Oh, that's a lot of new stuff, a lot of words that you might have heard or not. It's not that important. The important thing here is ASP.NET Core has a web server built in, and in practice it is sometimes combined with additional web servers for complex network infrastructures, but this is not relevant for today. For today, just press F5 and it will run. What it will give us next is a nice little page, which is an auto-generated documentation of all the web APIs that are included in our project. And by default, if you create a new web API, ASP.NET Core will add a very simple web API, which you can use to get the fictitious, of course, weather forecast. And here you see where you can reach this API. It's reachable under weather forecast with an HTTP GET. So what we should be able to do, and I ask you to do that too, just write HTTPS localhost 5001 weather forecast. And if you hit enter, you should see a fictitious weather forecast for the upcoming days. Of course, the temperature and the summary is completely made up, it's random, but we get a weather forecast. So this is the auto-generated API. Now we are going to stop this app. Yes, question? Okay, that's a good question. Maybe you have something like this, right? I guess you have something like this, yeah? You can install in your favorite browser some apps that format this JSON stuff. So what I did in my browser, I installed, let me go to here and here and here. And what did I install? I installed the Google Chrome plugin, which is called the JSON Formatter. This is completely optional. You do not have to install it. But if you want to have this nicely formatted JSON inside of Chrome, if you are using Chrome, then this would be an option. It's open source. It just makes JSON easy to read. You see what the description says here. If you use a different browser, please choose any kind of extension that you would like to use in order to get this nicely formatted JSON. But to be honest, it's not super important because you will rarely access the URL, the API directly in the browser. Most times you will use a tool, for instance, like Postman. I'm pretty sure that you have heard about Postman before in other courses, so I assume you have a little bit of knowledge here. And if I paste in here the weather forecast and hit send, I will see a nicely formatted JSON here. I also like to use the REST client in Visual Studio Code. I will show you that later on, but you can use any kind of client for APIs to test your web API. As I told you, Postman is a really good option. The browser will rarely be used, but still, you asked, and I told you which app I use to format JSON here in the browser. Do we have any additional questions at this point in the course? Okay, thank you for letting me know. So Postman is a nice tool for API testing. You can get it from postman.com. There is a free version and there are functionally richer versions. They are called team versions for which you have to pay. I encourage you to use the free version in this course. If you want to pay for it because you need it for professional work, hey, feel free to get it. It's not that expensive. But for this course, it's perfectly fine to get the free version. Postman works like this. If you run Postman, you can create some collections here. That's not so important, so I can get rid of that one. Essentially what you do, you select the HTTP verb, and in this case I want to get data. This is because this is why I select get here. Then you add here the URL that you would like to query, this one. And then you can specify headers somewhere here. I can get rid of these headers because they are not necessary. And I hit send. That's essentially it. And what you will get back here is the JSON body of your HTTP response. You can take a look at the cookies that you get from the web server. You can take a look at the headers that you get from the web server. And you can do a bunch of interesting stuff. For instance, you can write automated tests and so on, but we will not do that in the talk. I am not 100% sure if we will have a lightning talk about Postman. I'm not sure if somebody picked it. I mentioned that Postman would be a nice option for a lightning talk, but I'm not sure if somebody picked it. So this is Postman. Very simple to use and a very, very handy tool. Next step. Now that we have seen that the video game manager is just a console app, now we want to take a look how it is built. And of course, everything starts in Program.cs. Program.cs contains the main method, which is the same main method that you have learned about in the last few weeks. And I told you already, and this applies here too, in .NET 5, you do not absolutely need a main method. So what you could do, if you don't like all this video game manager program stuff, you can just delete the main method and remove the public here. And the last thing that we need is you can here add a using. And then you have the same code without the main method. It's completely up to you. If you think, hey, what's the point? Why should I remove the main method? It looks fine like that. I can live with that. then you don't have to touch Program.cs. I just wanted to make the point here that it is just a console app, nothing special. It's really just a console app. Of course you can do console right here if you want. Of course you can set a breakpoint. All the knowledge applies that we have walked through in the last few weeks. Okay? It's just a console app. What does this console app do? It creates the so-called host builder, host like in web host, like in web server. So it builds the web server, it configures the web server, and at the end it calls the build method to really build the web host. It is called the web host, and then it calls the run method, and that runs the web host. It starts the web server and keeps it running until you press Ctrl+C or until you end the console. Okay? In this course, you will practically never have to change Program.cs. In more advanced scenarios, when you take a look at practical projects, maybe even in your final year project or your 2-year project, if you use ASP.NET Core, you might need to change minor things in that area if you, for instance, add a fancy logging framework and so on, but you will read about it in the documentation. For this course, Program.cs is just generated and you can just ignore it. It is fine, leave it as it is. It's good like that. So, close Program.cs. I don't care if you remove the main method or if you leave it in just as it was generated. Both things are fine. The next step in the anatomy of our application is the startup method. Now, the startup method is really important, because in this startup method we will definitely add some code. And I would like to walk you through the functionality of this startup method only in a very brief way. So today is not the day where we dive into details. Today we want to see the whole picture. How does everything work together? And then we have the upcoming weeks where we dive into details, where we talk in more details about the configuration, in more details about dependency injection, in more details about routing and things like that. Today, it's all about getting the overall picture. Okay? Good. Now, this startup class has a constructor, and in this constructor we get an iConfiguration object. iConfiguration is something that we already know. Can anybody remember where we had iConfiguration before? We used it in Entity Framework to do what? Now this is the right cheat sheet. We had the factory, and inside of the factory we had this guy here. Can you remember? We said configuration builder.add JSON file, app settings JSON.build, and this one, this was the configuration. This was the iConfiguration, and we used it to get the connection string from the app settings.json configuration string. And when we were building our own console apps, we had to write all this code. The good news is that now that we are in ASP.NET Core, we don't have to write this code at all. Everything is done automatically for us. If you want to know the details, everything is done by this and that little methods. They are doing all the, as the name suggests, the default behavior. They are setting up the defaults for a web application. And by default, every web application reads settings from appsettings.json. So with ASP.NET Core, we don't need a factory anymore. We don't need to add a NuGet package for configuration anymore. It's just there. With iConfiguration, you can just access the settings in appsettings.json. That's exactly what we can do. So our life just got simpler, and that's a good thing. Okay? This is the constructor here. iConfiguration. It's generated out of the box. You don't need to add it manually. It's just there. Next, we have two methods which are very important, and we will definitely deal a lot with them. Today, only a little bit, but in the upcoming weeks, we'll talk a lot about these two methods because they are super important. The first one is configure services, and the second one is configure. In configure services, we configure dependency injection for ASP.NET Core. Remember what you have learned in Angular. You have dependency injection in Angular 2. Can anybody try to describe what dependency injection is? Imagine that a student from a lower class approaches you and says, hey, I heard about dependency injection, but I haven't really understood what this stuff is all about. What would you tell him? What is dependency injection? With dependency injection, you can register certain classes which provide certain logic, typically business logic, think of database access. You can register these classes on a central location. You can just say, this class is responsible for database access. And then everybody else in the entire application just needs to say, I need database access. And they will get the registered class automatically without you having to create the necessary class manually. So you are centralizing a kind of registry, which classes are responsible for which topics. You do that centrally in one location. And then everybody else, if they need any helper class to do something, to calculate something, to do database access, to access any other service, they just say, I need this helper class. And they get it from the central registry. That means that you can, for instance, do some settings. You can set some properties of these helper classes on a central location. It is very convenient in applications to have the configuration of your system, the setup of all these helper classes, so-called service classes or services, on a central location. That makes your application much more easier to maintain and easier to understand. And this is what dependency injection is all about. You create a central repository, no, not a central repository, a central registration object, a central service collection, where you register all these services and everybody else can ask this central registry for these helper classes later on. And this is exactly what configure services does. It, for instance, says, hey, ASP.NET, I would like to use controllers, web APIs. We'll see in a second what controllers are. And therefore, we just say, ASP.NET Core, add everything I need in order to work with API controllers. Don't worry if you don't know what API controllers are, you will see that in a second. Hey, ASP.NET, I want to have this nice documentation page where we saw a list of the APIs. Therefore, you need to add all the helper classes that ASP.NET needs in order to generate this nice little documentation page. And guess what? Exactly here we will need to register entity framework in order so that everybody else can ask for entity framework data access classes for the database context if they want to access the database. So here we need to register all the helper classes. I will now switch to the term service classes or short services. Here you have to register all the services that everybody else will need. If you don't have a clear picture in your mind, what I mean, that's not a problem, but you should get an understanding of what dependency injection is all about. Good. Configure services. Configure services, here you add so-called middlewares. What does middleware mean? You can imagine a modern web server like ASP.NET like a water pipe. Water is flowing in on one side, then flows through the pipeline, and at the end, a response, or let's say the water comes out again. And inside of this pipeline, you can change the features of this flow of water. You can, for instance, add some color, or you can make it hotter, or you can make it cooler, or you can increase the pressure by making the pipeline smaller. This is your mental picture that you can have in your mind. And this is exactly what this configure services method does. It sets up a pipeline through which every incoming HTTP request has to run through. And every little pipeline element, every little so-called middleware can do something with the flow of incoming HTTP requests. It can, maybe some of them, can just inspect the incoming HTTP request. It can take a look at it and, for instance, say, does this HTTP request have a proper username and password on it? Because if they don't, I will reject it. It's like a filter inside of a water pipe. If something comes through that shouldn't be inside the water flow, it gets filtered out. That could be something like authorization. You see that one? Something like this. Or you can add something to the HTTP request. For instance, the HTTP request comes in and you get a username and a password, and then you take a look at username and password and say, oh, this is foobar, that's fine, I will add the user ID, a so-called claim, to the web request so that later on, elements that are later in the pipeline can take a look at this user ID and do some appropriate choices. It is also possible to do some branching in this flow. For instance, here, see that one? Use Swagger. Swagger is the name of the technology for this nice little documentation page, just to refresh your mind. If I run this app, give me a second. If I run this app, you will get this nice little documentation page where you see all the APIs that your app provides. This is called Swagger. This technology is called Swagger. So in this case, I am telling the system, hey, if this is a request for this nice little documentation page, please handle it. If it is a request for Swagger, the rest down here is currently not relevant. But if it is not for Swagger, please continue to handle the request with the rest of the pipeline. Whenever we want to add some functionality to our web app, for instance, if we want to add some folder where static content is in, like pictures or HTML files or music or PDFs or JavaScript files, then we just add an additional middleware, just like putting an additional thing, an additional tool inside of our water pipe. This is what this configure method is all about. Whenever you need to add additional fundamental features to your app, then you add it to the configure method. So you are laying a system of pipes, and afterwards all the HTTP requests flow through the pipe. And by inspecting the HTTP request, ASP.NET selects how to handle an HTTP request. And what's going to happen if an HTTP request flows through this entire pipeline and nobody feels responsible for dealing with that request because it contains some strange URI that has no meaning for your app? Well, then you get a not found response from the website. Okay? Oh, that wasn't that trivial. But it's getting important. This is an important issue. Okay? Questions? Okay, so we have one last step, and then we will do a short break. Okay, give me 5 more minutes, and then we'll have a break. After we took a look at Program.cs and Startup.cs, we have to take a look at Weather Forecast Controller, because this is where the real web API happens. And there are only a few things which are really important here. And let me highlight that for you. This one. And this is the most basic way of building a web API. Once you got Program.cs and once you got Startup.cs, and in simple scenarios you don't need to touch Program.cs and Startup.cs at all. For instance, for your homework, you only need to do minor changes to Startup.cs. I will show you that. The rest is just auto-generated. What you will have to do is you will have to create such controller classes. Such controller classes, their name always ends with controller. So it has a postfix controller. Their base class should always be controller base. That's important. Don't forget that. Controller base. They should always have two attributes on top of that. API controller, just add it, believe me, it makes sense, it is useful. And route. Route defines where the API should be available. So in our case, the controller is called weather forecast controller. Therefore, it is by default available at localhost 5001/weather forecast. The postfix controller is automatically omitted. If you don't want to do that, if you would like to change that, you can just change it. Say WF, like weather forecast. So if I run this guy, now, you see it? We are no longer at weather forecast. We are now at /WF. WF, and it will give us our weather forecast. You can also add more elaborate paths here. You can say, I would like to run it on API/WF. So if I run it, guess what? The documentation changes automatically, you see? And now I can say API/WF, and it will give me my weather forecast. So the route defines where the API can be found. You can use this controller stuff if you would like to automatically generate the route from the name of the controller class, or you can write some string constant here in order to specify the route manually. Exactly that, exactly that. So if I write, for instance, API/controller, guess what? It is now available at API/weather forecast. Absolutely, if I rename this guy to just weather, something like this, and I will run it, it is now available at API weather. Just to prove the point, API weather, there it is. And last but not least, you have to specify the web API endpoints. And this is what we do here. We just define any kind of C# method, really just any method. It can return anything. It can return a string. It can return a single object. It can return a collection of objects, a list of objects. It can return anything that you know in C#. All you need to do is to write the HTTP and then the verb, HTTP get, HTTP post, HTTP put, HTTP delete. Any kind of HTTP verb can be on top of this method, and then this method will be run automatically by ASP.NET Core if the proper HTTP request comes in at the correct route with the correct verb. Understand what I mean? So if I set a breakpoint here, if I run the debugger, and if I say here API weather, this time I will not run it in Chrome. I will go to Postman. I stopped Postman, so this is the last demo. Then we will do the break. If I add that here, I will get back breakpoint. I can take a look at the code. I will run through it. I will get back the weather forecast. But if I change the HTTP verb to something which does not fit to the source code up here, HTTP get, now we have post, I will get method not allowed, because in this case we are not supporting HTTP post. Because if we want to support HTTP post, we would need to change that to HTTP post. Then it would work with a post request. Okay? What do we have to do if we want to add something new? HTTP post public string post return hello world. If we run it again, and if I go back to Postman again, you see it's still post. If I say send, I will now get back hello world, because now we have a handling function for HTTP post. So, summary, this is how you build a controller, and you will do that pretty often. This is how you write a very, very simple handler function. Or this another handler function. Of course, there is a lot to learn and know about these handler functions. And some of the things we will cover after a short break. So now we will do a short break, and after the break we will change the weather controller that we see here to build our video game controller, where we can add and maybe delete and get a list or maintain a list of our favorite video games. With that, let's go into a short break. I would suggest that we do 10 minutes break. It's now 9 o'clock, so let's continue at 9:15. Okay, that's a little bit more than 10 minutes. That should be fine. So at 9:15 sharp, please be back. I will stay in this meeting. I will just end the sharing of the screen, and I will continue at 9:15. You can also stay in the meeting and be back in a few minutes. Maybe enjoy a cup of coffee or get something to eat or drink or whatever, and be back in 10 minutes. See you in a few minutes.